Darkness had fallen over Israel, not just the kind that hides the stars, but a deeper one that lives inside the heart. The people who once walked in freedom had turned their backs on the God who delivered them from Egypt. Temples of idols rose where altars of faith once stood. The songs of praise had been replaced by cries of hunger and fear. For 7 long years, the Midianites swept through the land like locusts, burning crops, stealing livestock, and leaving behind nothing but ashes. Entire families hid in caves, clutching what little food they could find, praying for a miracle that seemed long forgotten. Every harvest season became a nightmare. As soon as the fields ripened, enemy riders appeared from the horizon, swift, ruthless, unstoppable. The Israelites would scatter, powerless against an army that seemed endless. Once a proud nation, they were now survivors in their own homeland. Parents told their children stories of Moses and Joshua, of seas that parted and walls that fell. But those miracles felt like distant legends. Hope was fading, and faith was a memory buried beneath fear. But history often turns when hope seems most impossible. Somewhere in the small town of Ophrah, a man named Gideon quietly threshed wheat in a hidden winepress. It was a desperate act of survival. He was hiding his grain from the invaders. Yet in that moment of fear, something extraordinary was about to happen. God was not absent. He was preparing to move through the most unlikely of heroes. Gideon was not a warrior. He was not a leader. He was a man who doubted, who questioned, who saw himself as insignificant. And yet, that is where the story of courage begins, not with strength, but with uncertainty, not with power, but with faith. From the shadows of despair, Gideon's journey would rise to prove that one person's trust in God can change the destiny of an entire nation. As we unfold this story together, you will see how fear turns into faith, how weakness becomes strength, and how even the smallest act of belief can break the chains of oppression. The story of Gideon is not just ancient history, it is a mirror for every soul that has ever faced impossible odds. If you enjoy stories that bring the past to life and remind us of the power of faith and courage, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue uncovering the forgotten stories that still inspire the world today. Now, let us step into the time of the judges, where one man's obedience would ignite a victory that no one saw coming. The night was still, heavy with silence, the kind that makes every creak of wood and whisper of wind sound like a secret being told. In the quiet hills of Ophrah, Gideon worked alone under the faint glow of the moon, threshing wheat in a sunken winepress to hide it from the raiders who prowled the valleys. His hands moved with quiet urgency, the rhythm of survival. Around him, shadows danced on the stone walls, and the air smelled of dust, grain, and fear. Each sound beyond the walls made his heart quicken. For 7 years, the Midianites had made life a constant test of endurance. Every harvest was stolen, every hope trampled beneath the hooves of enemy horses. It was there, in that hidden place of labor and anxiety, that something extraordinary interrupted the ordinary. A voice broke through the silence, a calm, commanding voice that seemed to carry both authority and kindness. Gideon froze, his heart pounding, his eyes darting into the darkness. Then he saw it, a figure sitting beneath an oak tree. Watching him, the man's presence was both human and divine. His words unlike any Gideon had ever heard. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." For a moment, Gideon wondered if the voice was mocking him. Mighty warrior. He was no soldier. He was the youngest son in a poor family from the weakest clan in Manasseh. His life had been one of hiding, not fighting. He turned, almost bitterly, and asked, "If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all the wonders our ancestors told us about?" The pain in his voice echoed the pain of an entire nation. Generations of promises felt forgotten, buried under years of oppression. But the stranger did not rebuke him. Instead, he looked at Gideon with eyes that seemed to see deeper than fear. "Go in the strength you have," he said softly. "Am I not sending you?" Gideon wanted to believe, but doubt weighed heavy. How could one man stand against an army? How could a farmer lead a rebellion when soldiers had already failed? Still, something stirred within him, a flicker of faith struggling to catch fire. Gideon hesitated, then spoke with trembling honesty. "If I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is truly you who are speaking." He hurried off and returned with a small meal, meat, bread, and broth, and set it before the visitor as an offering. The man touched the food with the tip of his staff, and instantly fire burst from the rock, consuming everything. In that blinding light, the figure vanished. Gideon fell to his knees, trembling, his heart overwhelmed by both awe and fear. He had seen something holy, something that shattered the ordinary limits of his understanding. From that moment, Gideon's life changed. Yet faith, even when born in miracle, does not grow overnight. When God spoke again and told him to tear down the altar of Baal in his own village, Gideon obeyed, but under the cover of darkness. He was brave enough to act, but still afraid to be seen. In the morning, when the townspeople discovered what had been done, they were furious. They demanded Gideon's death, but his father, Josh, stood in his defense, saying, "If Baal is a god, let him contend for himself." And so Gideon's name became known, Jerubbaal. Let Baal contend. Still, as the Midianite armies gathered in the valley once again, covering the land like locusts, fear returned. Gideon knew what he had been called to do, but his heart longed for reassurance. He prayed for another sign. That night, he laid a fleece of wool on the ground and said, "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, let the fleece be wet with dew and the ground around it dry." When he awoke, he wrung out the fleece soaked through, dripping with water while the ground remained dry. Yet even then, the doubt had not fully left him. He asked once more, humbly, for the opposite sign. The next morning, the fleece was dry, and the ground around it wet. These were not acts of disbelief, but the gestures of a man learning to trust beyond what he could see. Gideon's faith was not perfect, but it was real. It grew in the space between fear and obedience. God did not choose him for his confidence or his power, but for his willingness to listen, to question, to rise when called. By the time Gideon stood before his people, calling them to arms, he was still the same man who once hid in a winepress. The difference was that he now carried a promise greater than himself. His courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. And as the hills began to echo with the sound of gathering men, Gideon knew that this was only the beginning. The call he once doubted was now unfolding before him. The God who found him in hiding was leading him into a battle not just for a nation's freedom, but for the renewal of faith itself, a reminder that even in the darkest seasons, purpose can find us where we least expect it, and the smallest light can pierce the deepest night. Night descended over the valley, deep and quiet, save for the distant murmur of wind brushing through the trees. Gideon stood at the edge of his camp, looking out at the faint glow of countless enemy fires scattered across the plain below. The Midianites had come again, an endless sea of tents, soldiers, and camels that stretched as far as his eyes could see. Fear crept into him like a cold wind. He had answered God's call, gathered an army, and torn down idols, yet the enormity of what lay ahead seemed unbearable. Could he, a simple farmer, truly lead Israel to victory against such a force? The memory of God's voice still echoed in his mind, but so did the sound of his own doubts. The promise was clear. He would save Israel. But how? Faith is often tested in the space between what we believe and what we can prove. Gideon longed for something tangible. A touch. A sign, a whisper of reassurance that what he heard had not been born of desperation or imagination. And so he turned to prayer, not from disbelief, but from the fragile hope that God would meet him in his weakness. That night, under the stars, Gideon took a fleece of wool and placed it on the threshing floor. He knelt beside it and spoke softly, his words almost trembling in the cool air. "If you will truly save Israel by my hand, as you have said, then let this fleece be wet with dew while all the ground remains dry." It was not a challenge but a plea, the prayer of a man trying to bridge the distance between heaven's command and the limits of human courage. Then he lay down, his heart torn between fear and faith. At dawn, as light brushed the horizon, Gideon rose. The grass around him glistened with morning dew, but the ground was dry. He reached for the fleece, lifted it gently, and wrung it out. Water poured from it, soaking his hands. It was unmistakable. The sign was real. For a moment, relief swept through him, but it was quickly followed by another wave of uncertainty. What if this was coincidence? What if the dew had gathered on the fleece simply because of the night air? Doubt, subtle and persistent, whispered once again. So Gideon prayed a second time. Humbler now, almost ashamed to ask, "Do not be angry with me." He whispered, "Let me make one more request. This time, let the fleece be dry, and the ground covered with dew." It was a quiet moment between a man and his maker. No thunder, no lightning, just the stillness of faith seeking confirmation. When the next morning came, Gideon stepped out again. The grass around the threshing floor sparkled, drenched in dew, but the fleece lay dry, untouched by a single drop. He lifted it, turned it over, and saw that it remained perfectly dry while the earth around it shimmered with moisture. The sign was unmistakable. This was no accident, no trick of nature. It was as if heaven itself had reached down to quiet his restless heart. Something changed in Gideon that morning. The doubts did not disappear, but they no longer ruled him. He had learned that faith was not the absence of uncertainty, it was the courage to move forward despite it. Each sign, each whisper, each answered prayer had built a bridge of trust between him and the God who had chosen him. The miracles were not meant to prove God's power, those were already evident in creation, but to remind Gideon that divine patience meets human frailty with grace. As he looked once more toward the valley, where the Midianite camp stretched endlessly, Gideon no longer saw only an army of enemies. He saw an opportunity for God to reveal his strength through weakness. The fleece, simple and ordinary, had become a symbol of something greater, a conversation between a hesitant man and a patient God. It spoke of a relationship not built on perfection, but on honesty. Gideon did not pretend to be fearless. He did not hide his confusion. He brought them before God, and God responded not with anger, but with reassurance. When Gideon returned to his men, his steps were steadier. His eyes, once clouded with fear, now carried a quiet determination. The signs had not turned him into a hero overnight, but they had reminded him that he was not alone. He was part of a story much larger than his own, a story where faith was tested, shaped, and strengthened through uncertainty. That night, as the campfires of Israel flickered in the distance, Gideon sat alone again, the stars glimmering above. He thought of the angel's first words, "The Lord is with you." Mighty warrior. At the time, those words had felt almost ironic, a title too grand for someone so small. But now he began to understand. Strength did not come from might or numbers, it came from trust. Every sign, every act of obedience had drawn him closer to the truth that victory would not depend on his skill or courage, but on divine purpose. In that moment, Gideon finally felt peace. Not the peace of certainty, but the peace of surrender. The fleece lay behind him, the army before him, and in between stood a man learning that the greatest power is found not in those who never doubt, but in those who keep believing even when they do. The morning air was thick with anticipation as Gideon gathered his remaining soldiers by the spring of Harod. The cold water rushing over the rocks and catching the first glimmers of sunlight. The Midianite army lay camped across the valley, a seemingly endless expanse of tents and watchfires, and the enormity of the task weighed heavily on him. Earlier, he had called out to the Israelite troops, giving them the chance to leave if fear overcame them, and to his surprise, more than 2/3 had departed, leaving only 10,000 men behind. Gideon could have despaired, yet even in the thinning ranks, he felt the quiet presence of God guiding him, and he listened closely to the divine instruction that came next, an instruction that would defy every instinct he had learned as a man of the land and as a future leader of his people. God commanded him to take the men down to the water and observe how they drank. Those who lapped the water with their hands to their mouths, alert and watchful, were to be set apart, while the rest, who knelt to drink with their full attention turned downward, were to return home. It seemed strange, almost arbitrary to a mind trained in conventional warfare. Yet Gideon obeyed, his heart leaning on trust rather than logic, as the men bent to the flowing spring, drinking as their bodies needed. A pattern emerged. 300 men drank in the way God had specified, remaining vigilant even in the simple act of quenching their thirst, their awareness unbroken by the comfort of the water. All the others, though still loyal and willing, did not meet the criteria, and they were sent home. In an instant, the Israelite force was reduced from 10,000 to just 300 warriors, a reduction so drastic it might have crushed any ordinary commander. Yet this was exactly the point. God's message was clear. Victory would not be measured in numbers or the strength of armies, but in faith and obedience. By reducing the numbers so drastically, God was removing the temptation to rely on human power, ensuring that the Israelites would recognize the source of their triumph. It was a lesson not only for Gideon and his men but for generations to come. The greatest victories often come through the improbable and the seemingly insufficient, and divine providence can turn the smallest, weakest, or most overlooked into instruments of extraordinary purpose. Gideon now stood at the edge of the water, counting the 300 chosen men, each one a reflection of watchfulness, courage, and faith. He could see the tension in their faces, the same mixture of fear and awe that had coursed through him when he first asked for signs with the fleece. This was the moment when human doubt collided with divine assurance. The men's hands, still wet from the stream, were ready to lift not only swords, but the invisible weight of trust in a God who worked through the impossible. Every drop of water they had lapped symbolized their attentiveness, their readiness to act even in the simplest things. And this readiness would prove crucial in the battle to come. The Midianites, numerous as locusts with their camels uncountable as the sand on the seashore, posed a threat that dwarfed the tiny force gathered by Gideon. Logic would have dictated withdrawal, consolidation, or desperate fortification. Instead, Gideon followed God's instruction, knowing that the odds were intentionally insurmountable. The reduction of the army was not punishment or trickery. It was divine strategy, designed to magnify the glory of God and teach both Israel and the world that human strength is limited, while divine power knows no bounds. As the 300 men positioned themselves for battle, Gideon's mind reflected on the journey that had brought them here from the anxious threshing floor, where he had first been called, through the signs of the fleece, to this moment of apparent impossibility. Every hesitation he had felt, every prayer, every touch of reassurance, had been preparing him and his soldiers for this extraordinary test. This was the culmination of lessons in patience, faith, and obedience. The realization that God does not always use the mighty or the numerous, but often the few, the humble, and the vigilant night fell over the valley as they moved toward their positions. The 300 blending into the shadows with the quiet intensity of those who understood that they were not relying on their own strength. The distant fires of the Midianite camp flickered, oblivious to the plan forming against them. Gideon's heart, once heavy with doubt, now beat steadily with resolve. He had seen divine power manifest in the ordinary, a fleece soaked with dew, a tiny stream revealing the chosen soldiers, and now he would witness it unfold on the battlefield. Every footstep toward the enemy was a step of faith. Every breath a quiet affirmation that God's power could accomplish what human might could never achieve. This reduction of the army, the choice of 300 men, was more than a military tactic. It was a lesson etched into the story of Israel, a lesson that resounds across generations. When God calls, obedience matters more than numbers. And faith, even in the face of overwhelming odds, can turn the impossible into reality. The 300 soldiers, handpicked not by skill alone but by attentiveness, vigilance, and trust, embodied the principle that with God, the improbable becomes possible, and that the smallest among us, when guided by divine purpose, can change the course of history. Gideon, standing at the head of this diminutive army, knew that the coming battle would test every ounce of courage, every spark of faith, and every lesson he had learned from the signs and miracles that had marked his journey. Yet in his heart, he carried the unshakable certainty that victory would not be his alone, nor the men's, but God's, achieved through the obedience, trust, and readiness of those willing to step forward, even when human logic screamed impossibility. The night air hung heavy over the valley, a quiet tension broken only by the distant murmur of the Midianite camp as they settled for slumber among their countless tents and camels. Gideon moved with careful determination, his 300 men following silently, each one carrying a simple weapon of war yet imbued with a purpose far beyond the ordinary. There were no swords lifted high in the dark, no rows of archers ready to fire. Instead, each soldier bore a clay jar concealing a blazing torch, and a trumpet poised to sound the signal that would change everything. The arrangement was deliberate, a strategy born not of human ingenuity alone but of divine instruction. A plan designed to prove that it was not the might of the army, nor the cleverness of a commander, that would bring victory, but the unseen hand of God acting through the faithful and obedient. As they crept toward the outer edges of the Midianite encampment, Gideon's mind wandered to the journey that had brought them here, the whispered call at the threshing floor, the tests of the fleece, the miraculous reduction of their army to just 300 vigilant men. Each step forward felt surreal, the enormity of what they were about to attempt almost impossible to fathom. Yet beneath the fear and anticipation, there was a calm certainty, a deep understanding that this small band of men carried within them the power of something greater than swords or numbers. They were instruments of divine purpose, and the success of their mission rested not on skill alone but on faith and timing, on their ability to obey and trust in a plan that defied conventional reasoning. At Gideon's signal, the first moment of chaos erupted, with a sudden, coordinated movement. The men smashed their jars, revealing the hidden torches that flared into the night like sudden stars, illuminating the darkness of the camp in 1,000 flickering points of fire. The brilliant, unexpected light struck terror into the hearts of the Midianites, who had imagined themselves secure behind their massive numbers and sleeping confidence. At the same time, the sound of the trumpets pierced the air, sharp and commanding, echoing through the valley in a rhythm that was both terrifying and disorienting. The effect was immediate. Horses reared, camels screamed, and soldiers tumbled from their tents in confusion, unable to comprehend the sudden assault of sound and light that seemed to come from every direction at once. Gideon had positioned his men strategically, surrounding the enemy encampment in a wide circle, each group poised to strike from a different point. The combination of torches and trumpets was not simply a distraction but a psychological weapon, designed to magnify fear and create the illusion of an overwhelmingly large force. Panic rippled through the Midianite ranks as soldiers fled blindly, colliding with one another, trampling the very tents that were meant to protect them. In the darkness, with the fires reflecting in wide, startled eyes, and the unrelenting sound of the trumpets tearing through the night, the Midianite army became a chaotic, disorganized mass, their training and confidence utterly dismantled. Gideon's 300 moved with disciplined precision despite the tumult. They did not pursue recklessly, nor did they succumb to fear themselves. They trusted in the plan, in the divine guidance that had brought them this far. Each blast of the trumpet, each shattered jar revealing its blazing light, was executed in perfect unison, magnifying the sense of an unstoppable, encircling force. From within the chaos, Gideon called out to his men to maintain their courage and presence, reinforcing the extraordinary fact that victory did not require more soldiers, more weaponry, or even superior strength, only faith, obedience, and the willingness to act boldly under divine instruction. As the Midianites continued their frantic flight, many turning upon one another in blind panic, it became clear that what unfolded was no ordinary battle. Reports later would describe it as miraculous, a triumph that defied conventional understanding of warfare. The night that began with fear and hesitation for Gideon and his small army ended in astonishment as the camp of the seemingly invincible Midianites dissolved into confusion, scattering across the hills, leaving behind horses, camels, and supplies. Every movement, every note of the trumpet, every burst of torchlight had contributed to a complete reversal of fortune, where the smallest and most humble force became the instrument of overwhelming success. In the aftermath, as dawn crept over the valley and the echoes of chaos faded into the quiet of the morning, Gideon and his men stood in awe of what had been accomplished. They were exhausted but elated, their faith vindicated in a way that no conventional victory could have demonstrated. The story of that night, the clay jars, the torches, the trumpets, and the panic-stricken Midianites would be remembered not merely as a clever tactic, but as an enduring lesson that divine power can transform the improbable into the victorious, that courage and obedience can surpass numbers and weapons, and that even the most humble, vigilant few can achieve the extraordinary when guided by purpose greater than themselves. Gideon's triumph was a testament to the principle that faith, when paired with action, can overcome even the most insurmountable obstacles. The 300 men, chosen for their vigilance, became the agents of a miracle, their loyalty and readiness turning the night into a demonstration of divine intervention. The Midianites, once confident and numerous, had fallen not because of superior tactics or brute force but because the power guiding Gideon's army was beyond human comprehension. In this, the story reveals a timeless truth, that the seemingly weak, when aligned with divine will and acting with courage, can accomplish what the strongest and most fearsome cannot, leaving a legacy of inspiration that resonates far beyond the battlefield. As the dust settled and the echoes of battle faded into memory, Gideon returned to his people, not as a conqueror seeking glory, but as a humble servant of the God who had guided him through impossible odds. The victory over the Midianites was more than a military success. It was a testament to faith, to the power of obedience and trust in divine purpose. Yet even in triumph, Gideon's story was far from complete, for the lessons of human nature and the delicate balance of humility and pride were still to unfold. The Israelites, freed from the oppression that had tormented them for 7 long years, looked upon Gideon with awe and gratitude. His courage, wisdom, and steadfast faith had delivered them from overwhelming enemies, and their instinctive response was to offer him kingship, a position of authority that could have placed him at the pinnacle of power. It was a tempting offer, one that might have allowed him to shape the nation according to his own vision. Yet Gideon, remembering the source of his victory, refused. He understood that true leadership did not come from ambition or desire for power, but from obedience to a higher calling. By rejecting the throne, he demonstrated an extraordinary humility, choosing to serve rather than rule, and in doing so, set a model of righteous leadership for generations to come. Despite his refusal of kingship, Gideon's story takes a turn that reminds us of the fragility of human virtue. As time passed, and the immediate danger of the Midianites faded, he made a decision that reflected the all-too-human tendency toward pride and compromise. He created an ephod, an object intended for worship, which over time became an idol in the eyes of his people. What had been intended as a symbol of thanksgiving and devotion slowly transformed into a source of temptation and distraction, leading Israel into spiritual missteps once again. It was a stark reminder that even the most faithful and courageous among us are susceptible to human weakness, and that vigilance, humility, and self-awareness are ongoing responsibilities in the life of anyone who holds influence or power. Yet within these complexities lies the enduring strength of Gideon's legacy. His life teaches that faith is not a guarantee of perfection, but a call to action, to courage, and to trust in a purpose larger than oneself. His humility in refusing kingship shows that leadership is not measured by crowns or titles, but by the willingness to serve and the integrity to acknowledge that one's success is not solely the result of personal effort. Even his misstep with the ephod, while a cautionary tale, highlights the importance of accountability, reflection, and the constant struggle to align one's actions with one's beliefs. Gideon's journey from a hesitant farmer, hidden and fearful, to the deliverer of a nation serves as an inspiring reminder that extraordinary outcomes often arise from ordinary beginnings. His story illustrates that divine guidance often calls us into situations that challenge our fears, our doubts, and our understanding of what is possible. The victories we celebrate are rarely the result of our own strength alone, but of courage exercised in the face of uncertainty, of obedience in moments of doubt, and of faith that continues even when the path ahead seems impossible. For modern audiences, Gideon's story resonates far beyond the historical context of Israel and the Midianites. It is a narrative about the human experience, about facing fear, questioning one's abilities, making difficult decisions, and navigating the tension between humility and pride. It reminds us that leadership and influence carry responsibility, that our actions leave lasting impressions on those who follow us, and that even the smallest acts of courage and faith can change the course of history. In a world where challenges often seem insurmountable, and where doubt can overshadow confidence, the story of Gideon provides a timeless example of how faith, humility, and trust in a higher purpose can transform ordinary individuals into instruments of extraordinary change. As we reflect on his life, it is important to see both the triumphs and the lessons from his mistakes. Gideon's courage in battle, his reliance on divine instruction, and his refusal to seize power for personal gain inspire us to approach life with integrity, boldness, and faith. Meanwhile, his human failings remind us to remain vigilant, to guard against pride, and to continually seek alignment between our intentions and our actions. This balance of courage and humility, success and self-awareness, defines the essence of Gideon's enduring legacy and offers wisdom that transcends time. Thank you for following Gideon's incredible journey from doubt to triumph, and from humility to human vulnerability. His story is a powerful reminder that faith and courage can overcome even the greatest obstacles, that true leadership is rooted in service, and that we must remain vigilant against the subtle dangers of pride and complacency. If you found this story inspiring, do not forget to like, subscribe, and join us as we continue exploring the remarkable tales of faith, courage, and wisdom that history has to offer. Together, we can uncover the lessons of the past and apply them to our lives today. drawing strength from stories that remind us of the extraordinary potential within us all.